Thank you. This talk is going to be unusual in a couple of ways. One is it's unusual for the SSE IRVA group because I'm proposing a technology. And the second reason that it's somewhat unusual is that I'm wearing a tie. So I will try to be a little bit formal. Before we get into the technology, let's talk about the definition of cybotics. So cybotics is the branch of technology that deals with robots driven by psi-mediated intention. So they're physical systems driven by psi. This definition in the Oxford English Dictionary is fine, except that it's probably only going to come out in a few years. We invented this word. I was talking with my class on the science of psychic phenomena this last semester at the University of Colorado and described this, and one of the students, David Myers, suggested the word cybotics, and it stuck. And so that's what this is. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the basis of cybotics, what it is, how it works. It's based upon psychokinesis. And psychokinesis, as you all know, involves the micro psychokinesis, let me say, involves the manipulation at a quantum level of randomness using intention. And this can be carried out in a number of different ways and has been demonstrated over and over. I'm only going to talk about two ways very briefly. One is with the use of dice. And so all sorts of experiments have been carried out using the effect of intention on dice throws. And one meta-analysis was carried out in 1991 by Radin and Ferrari, and they showed that with 148 studies involving more than 2 million dice throws, the statistics were overwhelming. The z-score was close to 20, so that's a measure of how many standard deviations away from nothing the effect is, so it's a huge effect. The p-value corresponds to far less than 0.001, and so it's infinitesimal. The odds against chance are huge that this is a real effect. Another example involving psychokinesis involves using electronic random number generators. So these were developed for psi phenomena in the 70s and 80s by Helmut Schmidt, and the original random number generators involved atomic decay, and this produced then a randomness which was translated into zeros and ones, so bits which were randomly distributed. The biggest study of these electronic random number generators and how they can be manipulated was carried out in the Pear Lab, directed by Bob John, as described by York a little bit earlier. And they published in 1997 the results of 1,000 experimental series carried out over 12 years, in which they got huge odds against chance, p on the order of 10 to the minus 13. The plot that I'm showing here is a plot of the on the vertical axis. It shows how many bits you deviate from chance, from randomness, and the horizontal axis is in thousands of trials. And so when the operators aimed high, they ended up going towards the high line. When the operators aimed low, they went towards the low line, and then the baseline was somewhere in between. So this is another example of psychokinesis. So, all right, we've got these psychokinesis effects. We're proposing a technology to use them to make some sort of instruments, some robots that can be used, physical systems. So the question is, when can we do this? When will we be able to know that this actually works? The answer, perhaps surprisingly, is that it already exists, that there already are quite a few cybotic systems that have been demonstrated. So for most of this talk, what I'd like to do is describe to you what those cybotic systems are, how they work, and then at the end, we can together perhaps discuss how we might make new cybotic systems for practical applications. Before I do that, I want to make a distinction between cybotics and another system, and that is using brain waves. So we are not here using brain waves to detect systems. Instead, we are actually using psi to detect systems. So that's shown in this slide here. You can buy, for example, at a game store, MindFlex games, in which you use your mind to control a ball on a board. That's not what we're doing here. We're using a different medium altogether. So there were some early cybotics examples. One was called the Tachyscope, and this was published in 1986. The basic idea here is it's a little motor-driven robot directed by an electronic random number generator with a pen in it. And as the thing moved around, the pen drew on the paper, and they showed statistically significant effects. In 1995, a paper was published on the psychokinetic action of young chicks on the path of an illuminated source. That's just shown in the picture here. Little chicks were put into a cage, and they were then put into a darkened room with a little robot. And the robot was a random number generator-driven robot with a candle in it. And the chicks wanted the warmth and the light from the candle, presumably, and they were statistically significantly able to direct the machine to move towards them. In 1986, there was some work done using a 6-axis random number generator computer-controlled robotic arm and hand. That particular study showed no statistically significant results. Okay, so now let's get on to some examples that I'm going to describe in some more detail, and these are more current examples. One was carried out at the Pear Lab and published in 2007, and this was the response of a random event generator, an REG-driven robot to operator intention. By the way, an REG and an RNG are the same thing. The Pear Lab called these random event generators rather than random number generators. And the basic idea is having, again, a little RNG-driven random robot, and the direction that the robot moved was determined by the output of the random number generator. An operator sat on the side, as shown in the picture, and looked down at this little robot with a frog pasted to the top of it. And the frog started in the middle, and the operator, using intention, tried to get the frog to move towards him or her. And you can see in this chart on the bottom right that, in fact, if the frog starts in the middle, it wanders around a bit, but eventually it might move towards the operator. And various studies were carried out, and statistically significant results were obtained. It may not be the best way to get a robot towards you, but it works. Another example is the Celeron mind lamp. So Celeron is a company formed out of Pear Lab technology, and they built a number of instruments for using intention. One of them involves having an electronic random number generator that determines the color of a lamp. It has multiple LEDs in it. I have one of these in my office, and it's a lot of fun to play with. After a fair bit of practice, we've developed a technique to pretty reliably get the color that we want. And you can imagine my kids, whenever they visit, before they come into the office, they compete with each other to decide what color it's going to be this time. And they're often right. All right, so now I want to get on to a fairly controversial cybotic system. And I'm going to argue that this is, in fact, a cybotic system. And that is the Global Consciousness Project. You're probably all familiar with it. It consists of random number generators distributed around the world. This shows a map with the locations of these random number generators called eggs. And these eggs send the data to a lab in Princeton, which collects the data and looks for some sort of a coherence in the data, for deviation from randomness among the various egg samples that are being sent, egg the data from the various eggs. And this has been carried out over many years. The data is very robust, and a number of startling successes have been shown. Here are 3 examples. On the top left, I show the 9/11 terrorist bombing. The blue line shows a statistically significant result in what it would be. The red line shows the actual data from the Global Consciousness Project, and this is as a function of time, in this case, days. And, or was this hours? The red line shows that in the time before or around the 9/11 bombing, the data deviated statistically significantly. Another example is on the top right, where Obama wins the nomination in June 3rd, 2008. And once again, around the time, in this case plotted in hours, of the nomination, there was a significant deviation from randomness among the eggs, and the data showed, yes, there was something. This has been carried out through today. At the bottom, there's a more recent example, the Women's March on Washington in January 21st, 2017, which was a significant event in the United States. And around that period of time, once again, the random number generator results from around the world showed a significant deviation from randomness. I'm not going to get into the details on all of this. The data is robust. It's available for anybody to look at. I'm not going to argue with the quality of that. It's a very high quality experiment. However, there are some issues with it. And in fact, there have been some fairly strong arguments that this is not a global consciousness effect, but rather it's something very different. In 2009, Helmut Schmidt wrote a letter to the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and this is the same Helmut Schmidt who developed the electronic random number generator for psi experiments. And he said that the way that the outputs of these random number generators from around the world are combined is arbitrary, that in fact one might change the phase or the way that they're added or subtracted together, and that therefore the fact that you get some sort of a statistically significant effect must be due to something besides the harmony or harmonization of different intentions around the world. He said it's a classical goal-oriented effect, and that the person who's directing the Global Consciousness Project, Roger Nelson, it's due to his intention. So this is a typical experimenter effect, according to Helmut Schmidt's letter. And there was argument back and forth. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on the specific arguments. Another case occurred with Peter Bancel. So Peter Bancel was a collaborator of Roger Nelson's for a number of years in helping with the statistics and so on. And in the last couple of years, he's come out with a couple of publications highly critical of the logic behind it. And in order, I'll go through what it was he said in short form. So the way these electronic random number generators work is they produce the source, which may be an electronic source consisting of reverse bias transistors or something, produce blips at random times. But in order to make sure that the output is balanced, that you get an equal number of zeros and ones, typically this output is XORed. So that's a logical process, a logical gate in which you mix the signal with the output of a square wave generator, and that produces an equal number of zeros and ones. But the point here is that the product is no longer the pure randomness of the source. Instead, the product is now a manufactured product. It's a manipulated product. And so Peter said, there's something wrong here. It's being manipulated. We're not getting pure randomness. So there's got to be some intention involved in how this is working out. Another issue he raised had to do with synchronization. There's a timestamp for each of these data streams that comes from around the world. And Peter said the timestamp doesn't have sufficient resolution to give you the sort of coherence effects that you observe. So the point then is, what is happening? Is it global consciousness? Well, there are some contradictions to whether it's global consciousness. Is it an experimenter effect in which Roger Nelson is completely driving this thing? That's been the argument. I would argue something different. And my argument is that it's both. That it is, in fact, global consciousness, but the system is mentally programmed by Roger Nelson. And that's classic cybotics. Hard to say classic since we just invented it, but it's classic cybotics in the sense that it's a mixture of a physical system with a random source and experimenter intention or user intention. And so this combination is what gives you cybotics. Okay, let's go on to another example. In 2006, I was minding my own business in my office, and I was contacted by a person who had been selling some instruments for detection of contraband in Singapore and in Korea, and he wanted to sell them in the United States to the military, but he needed to know the mechanism of action in order to sell it to the military. So he came to me. I'm in the engineering school at the University of Colorado, and he said, okay, just figure out how this works so we know how we can tell the military. And I show you here the thing. It consists of a hand holder with a antenna pivot that pivots around, connected via a BNC cable to a box that contains the essence of the substance to be looked at. And it includes ivory or THC or explosives and so on. And the thing works. I used it. I found things in my house. He trained a technician in my lab who got to be quite good at using this thing, and it worked quite well. You can see me standing there below holding it. But I looked at this for about 1 minute, and I realized this is not an electromagnetic wave detector as he thought it was. And I said, go home and try it with a non-conducting antenna. It'll work just as well. And so that evening he tried it with a plexiglass antenna, and he said it worked just as well and was very surprised. So he had a very well worked out process for this and how to make it work. We designed a triple-blinded study to check the effect and make sure that it worked, and carried it out in a field in Boulder, Colorado. And he was the person operating the system. It failed. Not only was he not able to find the objects that were hidden, but he statistically significantly missed them and got the wrong locations. And he was absolutely devastated by this effect, and he went back home, and I never heard from him again. He stopped selling these. So that was fine and dandy. That was 2006. Then in 2009, I was reading the New York Times and saw an article that says, Iraq swears by bomb detector US sees as useless. And I looked at the picture and said, I know that thing. And it turns out it was the same thing. This was being built by a guy in the UK, James McCormick, as a bomb detection device. He was selling them for between $15,000 and $60,000 each, which is about 1,000 times more than it costs to build. And the Iraqis were using it and getting quite good results with it. They were quite happy with it. But then the US military came in and said this cannot work, and that was terrible. The Iraqi government spent £52 million buying these things. A few years later, 2013, I was contacted by the UK police department. They had arrested James McCormick and were making a case against him, and had heard that I'd tested it and wanted me to make a deposition. I was a little bit hesitant to do so because I know that this sort of dowsing apparatus does work, but under only specific conditions. And so I gave them the minimum amount of information I needed to. Then a few weeks later, I was contacted by the solicitor for the defense who asked the same questions, and I gave him the same sort of information. And a little bit later, here's an article in CNN, maker of fake bomb detector gets 10 years in prison, and investigators say that it put lives at risk. So a sad end to this story. This is a cybotic system, and it worked very well when it worked. All right, let's go on and go to another example. This example is something we built in our lab, and it was inspired by an experiment by Spottiswoode and May carried out in 2003. So Spottiswoode and May had a poor subject who was sitting next to an electronic horn that at random times would blast in their ear. Then the subject was wired up with various things, including a galvanic skin response that measured the conductivity of their skin. The conductivity of the skin is a very good measure of emotional response, and as you can imagine, when the horn went off, their emotional response went haywire. However, looking very closely at the data, something interesting was happening. This is a plot from their paper in 2003, in which they show on the vertical axis the conductivity of the skin, and on the horizontal axis the time. The t = 0 is when the horn went off. The response started a couple of seconds before this randomly timed horn went off. And it was a pretty robust result. It had been replicated many times. There's some controversy in its interpretation. Again, I'm not going to go into the details on that. But the fact is, it worked. So I thought, damn, why can't we build this sort of a system without these sentient bags of salt water? If we could do it instead and not have human beings, but instead just make it out of instruments, wouldn't that be cool? Then we could do psi much more reproducibly and show how interesting it is to work. So I came up with the following system to do it. It involves 2 electronic random number generators, so I'm going to call this the dual RNG system. The one on the right is the subject random number generator, and this subject random number generator is spewing bits out to a central computer, and the computer is recording it. Then at a random time, the controlling RNG, which is the one shown at the far left, shuts off the subject random number generator. And the idea was to see, could the subject random number generator anticipate its own demise? Would the bits that were being sent to the central computer show some sort of a deviation, a little bit of time before the subject was shut off? So I commissioned Adam Curry at Celeron to build this thing, and he did some nice work and built a system. Then a grad student of mine at the time, James Zhu, who is a very good grad student and very, very reliable, developed the software for this system with all sorts of controls and timestamps and so on to make sure that it was working the way that we thought it was working. Finally, we got to the day where it was going to be operating, and so he turned it on, and he did a few hundred trials. They seemed positive, did a few hundred more, and so on. So at that beginning time, he did 1,730 test trials and 730 control trials. So this is a plot showing the results. You can see that the blue line hovers around 0.5, which means half ones and half zeros. And the abscissa, the horizontal axis, is time before shutoff. Shutoff occurs at the right, at t = 0 on the right. And the test, the control consisted of the same thing as the test system, except we never actually did shut off the subject random number generator. And as you can see, it hovers around 0.5 and stays there. The test subject, on the other hand, was the one that was shut off, and about a second or so before shutoff, it deviated sharply from 0.5 and went down quite a bit. In general random number generator studies done around the globe by different groups, the effect size tends to be at about 1 part in 10,000. We got effect sizes of 1 part in 40. So these were huge effects. And it was very, very statistically significant. So this just blew our minds. We were really excited. We started thinking, okay, how are we going to use this? What is this going to do? And so on. So one of the things that you could do with this, for example, is to have a system in which, say, you're doing day trading on a stock market, and you shut off the subject random number generator at a predetermined time if the stock is going down at that point, and you keep it on if the stock has remained high at that point. Then you take a look at the output of this subject random number generator in the computer before the stock trade, and you can tell in advance of the stock trade, a few seconds, whether it's going to go up or down, and you can invest accordingly. And so you could do thousands and thousands of trades in a day, make lots of money, support my lab to continue the research, support the Society of Scientific Exploration, so we go to really fancy hotels. And so we got very excited about this thing. And then one of the things we wanted to do was try some variations. So we changed bit rate, we changed various other parameters in the system, and it didn't seem to go very well when we made changes. Then about 20 days later, we decided to replicate the original experiment with the original software, original hardware, exactly as described, and we got nothing, no effect whatsoever. So in this case, the test and the control were identical. They both gave you about 0.5. At that point, I realized, wait a minute, this is not what we thought it was. This is a classical effect where you get a strong effect to begin with. Later, it declines. This is an experimenter decline effect. And in fact, it's not the random number generators who are doing all of this work. It's us. It's our intention that sets up the random number generators to work this way. So this, in retrospect, is another cybotic system. It's a cybotic system in which you set it up to determine in advance whether something is going to be, whether an event is going to occur or not at a future time. And if you do it right, you can tell quite reliably whether this is going to happen or not. Okay, let me talk about another experiment that we did, and this is something that involves remote viewing. So we're calling this the machine-mediated remote viewing system. The experiment consists of two parts. The first part is the usual sort of remote viewing. So a subject attempts to draw a target hidden in an envelope. And so the subject picks an envelope, then draws the target, and later judges judge it. But we added an additional ingredient to this. And this is inspired by field reg experiments. We put a random number generator in the room sitting next to the subject. Unbeknownst to them, this random number generator was spewing bits out at the same time, which went to a computer. We then used that computer to draw a raster scanned image, and along with the image that the subject was drawing, the judges judged the raster scanned image. By the way, these were done at separate times. We didn't take the pair together. Each one was tested individually. So in order to draw the raster scanned image, we took about 50,000 bits per image and arranged them in groups of 100 bits, averaged them, and thresholded them so that they became either a 1 or a 0. If it was a 1, we would draw a dot. If it was a 0, we would draw nothing, and raster scanned it in this way. By the way, this was carried out by a student who took this Science of Psychic Phenomena, Edges of Science class that I taught in 2013, I think. And so this was his project. And so here's an example. I don't know if you can see it well enough on the chart, but I'd like you to judge. So the possible subjects were Zener card images. And so if you take a look at the drawing on the left, does it look more like a 0, a plus, squiggly line, box, triangle, star? Which would you say? Holler out. Okay, so here the loudest are the squiggly lines. Now the one on the right, which was judged separately, and before you judge it, let me give you little instructions here which we learned after judging these images. Because this is a very low pixel density image, there are naturally going to be pluses and squares because it's on a square array. So unless it's a really strong looking square or a strong looking plus, seek another image. If it's possibly a zero or possibly a squiggly line or possibly a star, choose that rather than the pluses or squares. So what do you think of that one on the right? Star. Well, at the time, the judges judged that to be a squiggly line as well. And so this was a rank order judging. It turned out in this case, the actual object in the envelope was a star. Okay, let's do another. What do you say for the drawn images on the left? Plus? Square. So it really depends on which of those two images you choose, right? What about the one on the right? Plus? Square? Okay, it seems like the pluses were the loudest. Let's see. So the judges judged a square on the left, a plus on the right, and in fact it was a plus. So the machine-mediated remote viewing was correct. The one that was judged from the drawn image was incorrect. We also carried out experiments in which there was just a machine-mediated remote viewing, where the subject just sat there and thought, but didn't draw anything. So what do you think about this one? Let me guide your thinking on this. I know this isn't fair, but if you look at it, does it look circle-ish? Nah. Wiggly line? Nah, maybe. But there's sort of an emanating quality to it, right? There's something that seems to be emanating from the center going out. At least that's what I thought when I judged it. And I judged it as a star, and in fact it was a star. Now, I just showed you 3 examples where the judging was correct. Of course, there were cases where the judging was incorrect. And this shows the statistics for the results. We did get statistically significant results. The raster scanned images were more statistically significant, or more significant in the results than the drawn images. And you can see that in the 2 left-handish columns, where the p-value was 0.02 for the raster scanned image. Then, when we did trials with only the MMRV, they were less statistically significant, and if you combine the two, we ended up with a study which showed fairly strong statistical significance. Just a few quick points here. In the remote viewing in MMRV runs, why was there a higher t-score for the raster scanned images compared with the drawn images? And I would argue that the reason is that there's an analytical overlay that may occur with the hand-drawn drawings. And according to my remote viewing teacher, Paul Smith, if say the correct image is a fork, you may see something going up like this and something going down like that, mistake it for a brush or a hand, and then you start drawing the wrong things. Presumably the machine doesn't do that. Then some other questions. Why was the raster scanned t-score for the remote viewing runs, ones where we did the drawing at the same time, larger than the t-score for the cases where you did only the machine-driven remote viewing? Perhaps because there was too much thinking going on with the ones where someone was just sitting there thinking. And when they were drawing, they were sort of applying their mind to draw something. So then comes a more deeper question. How can the arbitrary mapping of a raster scan produce an image, right? Because you could raster scan it this way, you could raster scan it this way. How you combine it is purely arbitrary. That's classic cybotics. It's the experimenter influence. So you in advance determine how you want it to work, and so it works that way. And then what other sort of images might you do this way? Well, you could do all sorts of things. You could do microscopy, you could look at ultra-fast processes, you could look at hidden images just as you do with remote viewing traditional experiments. You could look at images in the future. There are all sorts of things. Okay, so let's spend a minute or two talking about what sorts of issues there are in trying to make cybotics practical. If we want to start Cybotics Corporation, what do we need to do? First of all, we've got to choose the appropriate applications. If we want to have a mobile robot, like the Pear Lab, probably a bad idea, because it's going to wander all over the place. It's not a very efficient way to get the thing where you want it to go. On the other hand, if you want to do something where getting right more times than not is sufficient, like for instance stock market investment, then you've got something. A big issue here has to do with the reliability and reproducibility of the effect. Because what we're doing is we're applying mental control here. How do we do it? Well, one possibility might be something like controlled remote viewing. So controlled remote viewing takes the basic idea of clairvoyance and really refined it quite a bit till you got a very refined art. This was as done by Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff, which then became the remote viewing protocol. Can one do the same thing with micro-PK? Perhaps you can. I know it's been tried to some extent, perhaps not well enough. In a talk that's going to be given a little bit later this morning, Sean McNamara is going to describe some experiments that he's done in which he has been able to really control his mind to control a system and produce some pretty interesting effects. And I've actually done this with him and have been very, very impressed. Another issue might be using a physical crutch. For example, if you're doing dowsing, you've got a dowsing rod or our ATSC detector, which worked very well. There's a physical system. Somehow things seem to work better when you've got a physical system. Like psychometrics is a way of remembering somebody by looking at a physical thing that they had. Probably the physical thing doesn't contain any information, but it's a vehicle. And so having a vehicle to make this work might help it. And then finally, mind control. Yogis, meditators, people who are able to control their mind have been shown to really do a lot better on micro-PK experiments. So there may be ways to do this. So in conclusion, cybotics, which is physical robots driven by psi-mediated intention, can enhance human function. It's already worked. I gave a number of examples, including a mobile robot, Mind Lamp Global Consciousness Project, contraband detection and dowsing, prediction using a dual random number generator experiment, and machine-mediated remote viewing. So my question to you is, what applications can you envision? Perhaps something really simple, like a random number generator driven shuffle for your iPod, so that the music that plays is the one that you just want at that time. Or maybe you might even ask, is a pyramid a cybotic system? Is it actually driven by intention? I'd be interested in what you think. Thank you.
Okay, I don't even have to say questions and people are lining up. That's good.
Fantastic presentation, really interesting. I'm interested in the decline effect. What is the difference between, in your little stock picking device, between the intention you had initially where it was successful, and then the second time? Why would your intention be so different, and why would you then not get the same positive results?
I wish I knew the answer. I think the answer is probably going to be the same as what our speaker last evening, Gallenberger, talked about, that there's some sort of a purity of intention and enthusiasm that starts off an experiment and something seems to dissipate.
Yeah, let me suggest novelty. Somehow novelty seems to play a role in that.
Thank you.
There's potential here for hours of discussion, but I'd like to touch on just one point on the MMRV. I'm wondering why you chose to throw away so much of the information, given that especially in these later days. We're all accustomed to pixelated images on the news and elsewhere that have been turned into big blocks to try to obscure information and trying to see whatever we can beyond it. Do you think the judge might have been able to do better if instead of having an array of dots and blanks, you had retained the full numbers and had grayscale in different shades?
Very good point. The reason is that this was a student project, and he had time to do it one way, he did it one way, and that was the result we had. I would love to do exactly what you said. I'd love to do it with grayscale. I'd like to do it with a much finer array of pixels. And if somebody is interested in doing the programming on this thing and working with me, that would be wonderful. This is something where we just did it, and then the guy graduated, and now he's off working in some aerospace company somewhere.
My father was psychometric, and he utilized psychometry to found the field of highway safety in America. Dad's research at Harvard got Ralph Nader started, the book Unsafe at Any Speed. So he talked to cars, and he talked to inanimate objects on a regular basis. The inanimate object has a non-sentient consciousness and is aware of what goes on around it and records images in it. Okay? So it is not that the psychometry person is perceiving environmental stimuli. The object itself is being read for what it has perceived.
So what you say reminds me of a story where Bob John was showing the Dalai Lama around the Pear Lab, and as the Dalai Lama was leaving, and Bob John had answered a lot of questions, the Dalai Lama asked Bob, "Do you have a question for me?" And Bob asked, "Is this random event generator conscious?" The Dalai Lama thought for a minute, and he said, "If you think it's conscious, then it's conscious."
Hey, Garrett. Great talk. So I have an endorsement, caveat, and question that I'll try to do really fast. So endorsement is, I think from a Celeron standpoint, we obviously 100% agree with this programmability thing. I think there's probably dozens of examples that along the lines of what you're saying, so I think that's great. And it's important for people to realize it because I think it would save a lot of time in the explorations that they do. The caveat would be, I think, your effect size statement. I think the effect size issue is also subject to this programmability, so depending on how you define an experiment, it's very easy to scale it up and down by several orders of magnitude. That's one thing. And then the question would be, given that there's all of this psi missing and issues with decline effects, et cetera, can we ever actually have reliable applications even though we do have this programmability feature?
Would you ask the same question about clairvoyance before remote viewing was started?
Well, I think the mainstream still doesn't accept any of those things because we don't have the degree of deterministic reliability that we get from most technology in the normal paradigm. So, yeah, I think we can put these applications into that camp, but is there a hope to put it into a more conventional application camp?
Want to work with me on that?
We'll follow up.
Oh, as an engineer, I think I see a key to this when you show the decline effect in the robot itself. If we assume that it was the RNG and not the experimenter doing it. So if we treat the robots as semi-living or conscious, like was it Paul, the artificial ghost, decline effect suggests training effects. So if we can train a product that's based on a random number generators and then somehow make haunted randomizers that do what we want, because we've treated them as children and spent years in training until they start doing things, and then copy them, which is sort of how human beings are made. That's the opposite of the decline effect. And I got this from a waking up in the middle of the night with intense dream of a psi experiment, which the dream was the magic 8-ball was trained by the intention of hundreds of thousands of people. And when it first was made, didn't actually work, and it was purely random. But today, it actually is like a cybot that it's doing is making accurate predictions. So the experiment would be to look at random number generators and see if we have like 1,000 students come through on one of them, and try to get them to do something. Will the student intention slowly train our instruments to do what the students want? And then we can watch that happen over the months, where it's purely random when we start until it starts doing things.
Let's try it. Interesting. So we now have 2 votes for honoring the random number generator,
Okay.
or honoring the instrument. Yes.
Great talk, Garret. And maybe another word for this is psychotronics, which goes back to the 60s.
It's a little different. I actually watched your video on psychotronics recently just to see the distinction. But
Okay.
you're the expert, so
But-
please go ahead.
But also, let me say, I mean, there are radionics devices, but Harry Jabs and I did an experiment on pyramidal structures, which we found enhanced human intention with plant growth. The biomass was almost twice as large. This is dry weight biomass of Kentucky wonder beans that grew in a non-nutritive substrate. So with intention alone, it was about 16% more biomass, and it was about 36% more biomass with the pyramid plus intention. We published it in Cosmos and History. If you want to read it, it's on our website.
Thank you. So I do want to make the distinction here between psychotronics and cybotics, where one involves more just direct influence on living systems and another uses a machine to mediate it. You're saying in this particular case a pyramid did the mediation, and so that's an intermediate area.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Couple of quick things I have to